Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the country and in the world. Thank you for joining us to our virtual meeting. And we will start today's program with, as you know, a conversation between Mark Thompson and Dr. Fauci. So it's my pleasure to introduce briefly our two speakers. They need no introduction to an APS audience. Mark Thompson, an APS member since 2017, is the very recently former president and CEO of the New York Times, a position that he held since 2012, and he was very influential there in developing the Times digital strategy, which has proved so amazingly successful in recent months and years. Before joining the Times, he is from the UK, as you'll be able to tell with his beautiful accent. He was the Director General of the BBC starting in 2004, where he also reshaped that organization to meet the challenges of the digital age. Dr. Fauci, who needs no introduction to any audience, is currently the Director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. What I think people may not be as much aware of is that earlier in his career, he was a major researcher in the field of immunology. He made seminal contributions to the understanding of how the AIDS virus destroys the body's defenses, making it susceptible to deadly infections. His research has been instrumental in developing strategies for the therapy and immune reconstitution of patients with AIDS, as well as for a vaccine to prevent HIV infections. He's advised 6 presidents on HIV/AIDS and on many other domestic and global issues, including, as we know, COVID. He's one of the principal architects of the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a program that has saved millions of lives throughout the developing world. He's been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal of Science, and too many to take our time with now. He was elected to the APS in 2001. I'm going to turn it over to Mark and to Dr. Fauci. I'll just say that when their conversation is over at 1 o'clock, please do not Zoom off, because without a break, we're going immediately to our next speaker, Dr. Merlin Sheldrake. And I know you don't want to miss that. After Dr. Sheldrake's talk, we will have a somewhat substantial break. So, gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon, Dr. Fauci. We've got about 50 minutes in total. And there's a chance to ask questions. If you have questions in the course of our conversation, you just type them into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to some of the questions as well over the course of the next 50 minutes. But Dr. Fauci, it's rather nice to be able to say that I think today we can begin with some very positive news. And I'm talking, of course, about the very encouraging news about the Pfizer candidate vaccine on Monday. I understand the Moderna trial has also reached a key parameter. They're now studying data. Can you give us a sense? There's obviously been a great deal of political and media attention. Can you give us your assessment of how much of a game changer today's news could be?
Well, Mark, it's an extraordinary game changer, because vaccines clearly are the tool that's an absolutely essential ingredient of getting control of any outbreak, particularly of a viral disease, and one of the extraordinary nature of this historic pandemic that we're living through. The important part about it is, A, it was successful, but importantly, it was successful at an extraordinarily high degree of efficacy. In fact, we did not really expect, we had hope, but we didn't expect that it would be that good. It is greater than 90%, likely close to 95%. That's good news. The other good news, which you alluded to, was that another company, Moderna, who has almost essentially an exact replica of this in the sense of it's a messenger RNA platform, a certain type of a vaccine, they are now will be looking at the data very soon. When they get a certain number of events, they look at the data. And we fully expect, though you never want to get ahead of yourself when it comes to vaccines, we expect that the results would likely be along the magnitude of what we saw with Pfizer. So that's double barrel good news for us here, even though we must still say we are in the middle of a dreadful situation when it comes to the global and domestic outbreak, which every day sets another record.
No, I'm sure we'll come on to, as it were, how we get from here to there, as it were. But if I can just stay with these two vaccines, the technology, this mRNA platform technology, is a new technology, as I understand it, in the development of vaccines. To what extent does the fact that it's new present obstacles or delays in relation to testing for safety? And also, I understand that these vaccines currently, certainly in their current iteration, are probably both going to have to be distributed and stored at very, very low temperatures. Is that going to slow down the rate at which, as it were, these things can be got out to the public?
You know, that's an interesting question. And I think in some respects, it's going to work in the opposite direction. The newness of it, where instead of having to grow the virus up in the classic way, purify it and either inactivate it or attenuate it, when you have the platforms like mRNA, all you needed from the very first day was the sequence of the virus. So the virus was identified and put on a public database of the sequences on January 9th by the Chinese. Literally 5 days later, we were making vaccines. And then 60 some odd days later, we were in phase 1 trial. And several months later, we're in phase 3 trial. That is overwhelmingly the fastest we've ever gone. So rather than slow things down in that respect, it's actually speeded things up. But as to your question, what about the safety aspects of it? There were several things we didn't know about the mRNA. We didn't know, since it was a new platform, whether it would induce the kind of response that would be protective. So there are two aspects of a vaccine that are dominant. One is its efficacy, and the other is its safety. So there were two unknowns. Is it going to be effective, and is it going to be safe? Well, we've answered the first question. It is very effective. I mean, really quite strikingly effective. The real efficacious, that is, we got to show its effectiveness in society. But the safety is going to be approached just like the safety of any other vaccine. We've gone through the phase 1, phase 2, and now phase 3. Even though phase 3 is generally directed to see if it works, built into the phase 3 study is clearly the parameters of looking for safety, so that this is being followed very carefully. And then the studies will go on a year or two beyond the end of the study. So I believe we will be addressing both of those considerations that you mentioned. And I don't think it's going to slow anything down.
Okay. Now, I'm sure we're going to come more broadly to the challenges of communicating health and science messages in 2020. But if I can ask a couple of questions about as it were, acceptability by the public of the vaccine. I mean, the first question, I guess, is if the object is to have a population herd immunity built up, not by everyone getting the disease, but by people being vaccinated. I'm interested in how deep the vaccination needs to go to achieve that. I'm sure every bit helps, but to get a really good effect, how deep into the population you need to go. And how confident you are that once vaccines are available, that the US population will be prepared to take them. There's some quite troubling polling data on this. By September, Pew in mid-September were polling people, and only about half the population, 51%, were saying they would definitely or probably be prepared to be vaccinated with a vaccine for COVID-19. 49% said they probably or definitely would not, and that's lower than it was in the spring. So there's some kind of mountain to climb in terms of convincing a large proportion of the population they should actually be vaccinated. So I guess two parts: how many people need to take it to get the effect that you would want to see, and how do you go about convincing them to actually get vaccinated?
Right. Okay, so two extraordinarily important questions. The first question is we don't know the precise number there because of the lack of experience with this particular pathogen. Whereas with something like measles, we know exactly from many, many years of experience what percentage of the population needs to be protected in order to get true herd immunity, where you don't get an outbreak. We're projecting that it's somewhere, I'd like it to see 90% of the population do it, but I think we can do it with probably 75% or more of the population. If we get 75 or 80% of the population vaccinated, I think we'll be able to get that degree of immunity together with the people who've already been infected to really have an umbrella or a veil of protection around the community. So it's going to be way up there, which gets to your second question. The numbers that you've given from the surveys tell us that we have a challenge here. And I believe that because of the high degree of efficacy of the vaccine, we're going to be able, if we're very transparent, which we will be, about the data as it comes out, and get the public to understand the process whereby decisions are made to approve or not a vaccine. The independent data and safety monitoring boards, the advisory committees, the career scientists at the FDA, the general scientific community, which will have a look at the data and know the data upon which decisions are made. If we can communicate that effectively to the general public, I think there are two things that'll turn that number around and get a lot more people willing to be vaccinated. One, when you find out you have a 95% effective vaccine, that's different than telling people we have a 55, 60% effective vaccine. I think people say, well, my goodness, if it's 95% effective, and I'm pretty certain that they're telling me the truth about safety, I think I might change my mind and get vaccinated. I think you're going to see a lot of that. The other thing is how good we are at communicating to the public the transparency of the process. If we're successful in both of those, I believe we'll get to the goal of getting the overwhelming majority of the people vaccinated.
Thank you. Now, there's lots and lots of questions coming in. I'm going to ask one right away, which is a question actually about the Pfizer trial, and it's a simple piece of information, I guess. This is from Richard Garwin. All we know for Pfizer is that the, quotes, more than 90% effective is based on 94 persons in the trial becoming infected. How many of these were in the vaccination arm of the trial and how many in the placebo arm?
Well, if you do the math, you could come to it's probably 90 people in the placebo group got infected and 4 in the vaccinated group. I mean, that I haven't seen the direct numbers, Mark, but you know I've done these calculations a lot, so I can tell you that's likely what it's going to be.
And we're seeing lots of questions of the kind of how long will these vaccinations, or let's take the Pfizer vaccination, how long will it confer protection is a question. And there are broader questions. For example, from Robert Kirshner, how will you decide when next to fly? I guess, how will you, Dr. Fauci, decide when next to fly in a commercial airplane? So, in terms of normality, how long, if I get one of these vaccinations, will I be protected? And more broadly, how quickly can we expect to get from where we are now, this very extraordinary state, to something which resembles normal life where you can travel freely?
Okay, that's a very good question. The durability of the protection is something that's unknown at this point. If you want to get some hints at it, you can look at things like what is the durability of protection of other coronaviruses. Most people don't fully appreciate that there are 4 human coronaviruses prior to the pandemic coronaviruses that you and I get infected with. About 15 to 30% of all the common colds that we get each year repetitively are from one or more of these coronaviruses that cause the common cold. The bad news about that, or the sobering news, I wouldn't say it's bad news, but somewhat sobering news, is that you get reinfected with it, which means that the durability of protection is not like measles, where it's measured in a lifetime. I mean, if you get infected with measles, the chances are you're going to be protected for life. Same thing with something like smallpox or other types of diseases. We don't know what the durability is. It likely is not going to be 20, 30, 40 years. It likely would be a year or two. Whatever it is, we just want that first round of protection. And if it turns out that we ultimately have to go back intermittently for boosts, that's not so bad after all, as long as you have a highly effective vaccine. So that's the answer to the durability question. The answer to when someone can get on an airplane and feel safe, or do the kinds of activities, going to a concert, going to a movie, going into a restaurant, and having to wait to sit down because there's a crowd in the restaurant, the way many of us have to do, that is going to be a period of many months into 2021. And I think that we'll get a better handle of that when we answer your prior question of how many people actually get vaccinated with a highly effective vaccine. If we get good uptake and good vaccine acceptability, and we get the majority of the population, overwhelming majority, vaccinated, by the end of this year, we can be approaching a form of normality that I think would be quite acceptable to people. I don't think, Mark, that for quite a while, we're going to be able to completely abandon the public health measures that we do, the wearing of masks under certain circumstances, the avoiding of congregate settings indoors. But I think people can get back to a form of normality. I want to add one extra aspect to it. Since we know that this virus is extraordinary in its impact on different demographic groups, namely the young versus the middle age versus the aged versus those with underlying conditions. I think people who are at risk for serious disease, namely those with underlying conditions, are going to have to be more careful for a longer period of time, I think, than others. So people are going to make an assessment of the risk-benefit ratio of the things that they're going to want to do as we get further and further into more protection. They're going to have to make a decision, at what point do I feel safe enough, given my risk category, that I'm going to be able to be going into the normal area of existence.
And do you feel confident that in terms of prioritizing who is given the vaccine first, that as it were, that the United States can make a good job of efficiently, both in terms of vital tasks and people in the health and medical industry, and also vulnerable groups, that the right people will get protected first?
Yeah, I think that there is a degree of confidence in that most people would be satisfied. This is not going to be decided in a closed door, dark room. It's going to be decided by advisory committees. The ultimate decision and implementation is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But traditionally, over many years, they've relied heavily on advice from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP, which will advise them as to the prioritization. Given the special nature of this outbreak, the National Academy of Medicine is also weighing in on that to make recommendations. And it likely will be, I'm not going to get ahead of them, but it likely will be healthcare workers who are on the front line taking care of individuals, either together with them or closely related, will be people who are vulnerable, people in nursing homes, people who have underlying conditions, those who might best benefit from protection because of the risk they have of a serious outcome. And then you'll work your way down society. School teachers, people in school, people with essential jobs, and then just any normal other healthy person will likely be on the fourth or fifth level down.
Now, a few members, for example, Thomas Klein, I've got an anonymous attendee who's asked the same question, have got this question: of those who are vaccinated, but who nevertheless get the disease, will their vaccination make their symptoms less severe, as is the case for flu? Did this study give the answer? And an anonymous attendee asked, I think a slightly different question: will the vaccine help an already infected person, and will they show symptoms? So I think this is a question about if you are vaccinated and the vaccine is ineffective in your case and you become ill, will it ameliorate the symptoms and the outcome of the disease? Or if you've actually already gotten or sick with COVID, would being vaccinated help relieve your symptoms in that circumstance?
Okay, so the first question is going to be easier than the second question, but I'll give you answers to both of them. When you have a situation, so let me start off with the second question, which is important. So once you get infected, your body's immune system is responding to the virus in you to help clear that virus. It is extremely unlikely that getting vaccinated while you are actively infected is going to help you get over the response, because there's nothing more powerful than the virus itself in triggering a good immune response. So if the virus itself is not triggering the immune response, a vaccine is not going to be better than the virus. The other question is, if you get infected and your vaccine didn't protect you against infection, could it protect you against serious disease? And the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason is that if you look at the endpoints of the vaccine trial, the first endpoint is not protecting you against infection. It's protecting you against clinically recognizable disease. The secondary endpoint is, does it protect you against infection to begin with? And does it protect you against serious disease? So we're going to know from the results whether it protects you against serious disease. If it acts like any other vaccine, including influenza, Mark, we would know that you can get infected, but still get a significant benefit from a vaccine to prevent you from going on to serious disease.
Thank you. Now, we've got a question which came in actually a day or so ago from Harvey Feinberg, who of course is the President Emeritus of the National Academy of Medicine, currently President of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. This is a question, really a bigger question. SARS-CoV-2, first recognized in humans in 2019, represents the third coronavirus emerging infection since the turn of the 21st century, after SARS in 2002 and MERS in 2012. Looking beyond the urgency of having one or more safe and effective vaccines against COVID-19, what do you think are the prospects for developing a universal corona vaccine? Do you think the effort to develop a universal influenza vaccine could hold lessons for coronavirus and or vice versa?
That's an excellent question. And Harvey nailed it right down, because that's exactly what we are now putting a major effort looking forward of doing that. We've had three, as Harvey pointed out, three pandemic coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. It would be foolish for us to think that since this is a virus that is embedded in the animal kingdom, particularly with regard to bats and other intermediate hosts, that we are not going to see the emergence of another new coronavirus. Whether it will have the pandemic potential, I hope not, that we're seeing with this extraordinary virus that we're dealing with. But we do need coronavirus universal vaccines the same way we need universal influenza vaccines. So there will be a major effort in that regard.
Okay, now there's, I have to say, a very large number of questions on the topics we're talking about. I'm actually going to move on and just go back to something we touched upon, which is we're at a point where there's some very encouraging news about vaccines, which potentially will become available over the coming months. We're also at a moment when we're seeing pretty troubling spikes in the infection in many countries. Western Europe's a good example, but many countries around the world, and in the United States itself, in really quite frightening numbers in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and although death rates are lower, I know that's moving upward as well. Can you, first of all, simply just give us, again, your assessment of where we are, and perhaps also reflect, I mean, you might say that the good news about vaccines in the near future, in some respects, might be a distraction from the urgent task of trying to ameliorate the immediate situation right now. So where do you think we are in terms of the coronavirus itself in America and around the world?
Well, I'm very glad that you brought it up in that context, Marcus. I would not want anyone to think that the enthusiasm about our vaccine potential is a signal that everything is okay, because everything is not okay. We are going through a historic outbreak, likes of which we haven't seen in 102 years since the 1918. But right now, today, as we speak, we are in a very serious situation. Literally every day breaks another record. We've had 140,000 new infections. 4 months ago, when I testified at a Senate hearing, I said that if we don't get control of this, and at that point there were 40,000 infections per day, we could reach 100,000. A lot of people thought I was being hyperbolic about that. No, that's not the case. We're there now. We have 60,000 hospitalizations, 240 plus thousand deaths thus far. And if you look at the heat map of the United States, namely those states within the 50 states that are lit up as having more infections, more than 40 of them are going in the wrong direction. As we are in now the cooler months of the fall, and will soon be entering the colder months of the winter, including the holiday season, when people will be congregating, for example, for Thanksgiving, and then after that with Christmas, and then the shopping season. We are in a very vulnerable situation. So what we've got to do is say, yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel with a vaccine. But what we need to do right now is double down on our public health measures, wearing of masks, avoiding crowds and congregate settings, keeping distance, doing things outdoors more than indoors, washing hands frequently. We don't need to lock down the country, but we've got to do a very intensive attention to those public health measures. Because between now and when we get to your earlier question, Mark, when will the country be protected by an umbrella? That's not going to be for several months of that. So we have several months looking at, yes, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I've often said metaphorically, the cavalry is coming with a vaccine, but between now and then, we have to intensify our efforts. So we don't want anybody to read in the newspapers or see on television that we have a successful vaccine and then go about their business thinking, well, everything is fine. I don't have to worry about anything. Not at all. That's an incentive to keep things going until we get the vaccine.
So also this week, we've seen President-elect Biden set up a coronavirus task force, and the task force will be presumably recommending to the incoming president how the federal government should respond from, as it were, the middle of January 2021 onwards. Between now and then, it'll be the Trump administration, the current administration, continuing to guide both messaging and also actions from the federal government on the pandemic. What's your advice to policymakers, and we don't have to say which set of policymakers we're talking about what the federal government could do, and what could the federal government do it's not currently doing to get on top of this fresh spike of the illness?
Well, as a public health person, as a scientist and a physician, Mark, my message is going to be exactly the same, regardless of administration, both from a public health standpoint and from a science standpoint. Clearly, right now, we know what works. We do know that the fundamental public health measures that I just outlined for you, if universally implemented, not in a disparate, scattered way, some do, some don't. Look at the map of the country. Over 40 of the 50 states are involved. So we need everybody across the board to do that. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking now or after January 20th. It doesn't make any difference. Those are the things that the message from me and my public health colleagues will be consistent, that needs to be done. In addition, from a scientific standpoint, we need to keep pushing the envelope with regard to getting multiple candidates of vaccines approved, because remember, we live in a global community. We want to and will protect the citizens and the occupants of the United States as our first priority. But there's also the situation that we want to help with our scientific expertise in the development of vaccines that could be used globally, because this is a global problem. And if we don't snuff this out globally, we'll never really be totally safe in this country. So we've got to look at it as a global problem and be all in globally with our colleagues throughout the world. The same thing holds true for therapies. You know, we have reasonably good therapies for advanced disease. We do need more and better therapies early on, namely for people who have infected so that they don't go into the hospital. We've got to keep people from requiring hospitalization. And you do that with early treatment, with a intervention that you could easily administer as an outpatient. Those things are not going to change. I'm going to be talking about it indefinitely, and my colleagues will be also.
And when you look around the world, I suppose my basic question is, from the experience of different countries in 2020, are there lessons to draw from, as it were, comparative studies of different countries? I know it's a bit early to do that, but we've seen very different outcomes in terms of numbers of infections and numbers of deaths in different countries. And we've also seen, interestingly, I think, very different outcomes in terms of impact to the economy, to GDP. And if you plot those two, it's not obvious there's a very strong correlation. And although there's been a very noisy debate in many Western countries about the supposed inevitable trade-off between effective lockdowns and other control measures, population control measures, to try and reduce or decelerate the illness versus jobs and the economy. Some countries out there seem to have achieved really quite low infection and death rates, and also a pretty low impact to the economy, and indeed rapid return to growth. Are the lessons straightforwardly that countries, I mean, the UK is a good example, my country, of a country which has seen, unfortunately, a very, very high level of deaths per 100,000, and seen a very, very big economic impact. So it's possible to get, as it were, both numbers looking very bad. Do you want to just help the audience pick their way through, insofar as you can? And I know there are many, many different factors involved. What's going on there? And the fundamental question, are the ways of organizing and being prepared and acting and messaging, which has worked very well in other countries, that countries like the UK and the US could learn from?
Yeah. Well, I think the key word, Mark, that you mentioned in your question was it's multifaceted and many, many issues involved. So let me try and just address briefly a few of them that I think it would be helpful for the listeners and the viewers to at least hear about. Is that, yes, there are certain lessons that you can learn from what's gone on in other countries. But the one thing you can't do is you can't make the United States of America, this very large country, this very disparate country, geographically, climate-wise, culture-wise. You can't make the United States a Taiwan. You can't make the United States a New Zealand. You can't make the United States a China. So there are certain characteristics of other countries that lend the response to an outbreak much more easy. For example, if you could, Australia was a great example of that. They've done a terrific job. They could just lock everybody out. New Zealand could do the same thing. Taiwan did the same thing. Then you could have a smaller population that you could actually get a more uniform response. You said something interesting that I want to point out, that we are the closest right now to the UK in so many ways. Guess what? We were formerly a colony of the UK. So we're very much like, in so many ways, culturally and otherwise, we're a bit more diverse, but I think the UK is also quite diverse. But if you have a country that the feeling is that when the leader says something, everybody does it. We've seen that a lot more in the Asian countries, where you could say, this is what we're going to do. The situation that we have in the United States and in the UK too, I think you know that, and I've heard it from other of my British friends and colleagues that when the government tells you to do something, there's almost immediately like, wait a minute, don't be telling me what to do. And when you have 50 states where the fundamental basis of the founding of our country was a federalist approach, where the states have a little bit of independence, it is very difficult sometimes to say, these are the guidelines that you've got to follow, A, B, C, and D. And then you find out that you have multiple states that feel they want to do it a little bit differently. That makes it very difficult to get the kind of response that some countries who, when they snap their finger, everybody does it the same way. So the lessons are that certain things that other countries do is very positive for responding, but I'm not sure all of the countries can do that.
It's interesting. In the UK, I think many people look to Germany, which is a bigger country than the UK and also right in the middle of Europe, and can't cut itself off. It's a federal country, and yet they seem to actually perform pretty well. And in addition, perhaps the national temperament, you've talked about the sort of Anglo-American kind of individualism and rebelliousness, but maybe that's a difference. But people say about Germany that there's rather greater clarity about the responsibilities of the federal government, the lender, the states and municipalities, and who does what, and the handoffs between those three layers of government. Greater willingness for the different regions to learn from each other, and arguably better preparation after SARS and MERS in terms of test and trace and being ready for pandemics and having the PPE supplies and all the rest of it. Does any of that convince you?
Oh, yeah, no, actually, you bring up a really good point. The good news is that the United States was barely touched by the original SARS, whereas other countries, Canada is a good example. I mean, they're our neighbors. They got hit by the original SARS. So they know what it feels like to get threatened like that. So they were really quite well prepared. Some of the Asian countries that were right in the middle of the SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003, they learned a lesson from that. So although I'm pleased that we were not hit at all by SARS in 2002, 2003, in some respects, maybe if we were, we would have had a taste of what was like and what we needed to do.
Now, I've got, I think, a related question which came in from APS member Ken Frazier, who's, of course, Chairman, President, and CEO of Merck. One of the most challenging things facing political and industry leaders is how to strike the right balance between the most urgent issues in the near term versus taking actions today that will set us up for longer term success. In public health, one example is pandemic preparedness. How can we use the current COVID-19 pandemic to get the policymakers and the general public to allocate resources for future issues like antimicrobial resistance, pandemic preparedness, and bioterrorism?
Yeah, well,
what
I can tell Ken, my dear friend, is welcome to my world, Ken. Well, that's exactly the case. I mean, well, the United States, for example, has poured enormous amount of resources into the current problem we're facing now. What I would hope, and what I think Ken is referring to, is that we need to have corporate memory that goes beyond just a minimal period of time. Because I know when I'm out there and we're not in a pandemic mode, that when I'm talking to be at the Congress or other organizations about what we need to do to prepare for something that hasn't happened, you're always hit with a little bit of a wall of saying, yes, but look at all of the things we need to take care of now that we're dealing with. So something that's in the future always takes second to the things you have to deal with now. So what I'm saying is that the bad news is that we've got hit terribly, severely with this historic pandemic. I hope that that triggers in most of us a realization that we can't let this happen again. So we've got to be preparing for things. And you mentioned a few of them, the challenges of something like multiple drug resistant pathogens, the challenges of a variety of other medical conditions. We've got to be prepared. So let us just not forget what we're going through right now.
And what does that mean for you, for the future of your field? We had a conversation at an APS public meeting a few years ago about infectious diseases, and one of the topics was how there had been an issue, I have to say, reducing in the 21st century, but nonetheless of many people, possibly even some health leaders, thinking that the issue of infectious diseases was significantly solved, and there were other kind of bigger priorities in health. No one could believe that after the experience of 2020. So are you hopeful that bright new scientists, that funding, that political support is going to flow into the field of the research and preparing for infectious diseases?
Yeah, I hope so, Mark. I think what people are starting to understand is something we say often, and we're backed by the reality. It isn't guessing. It isn't hyperbole. We have had transforming outbreaks of infectious diseases as far back as pre-ability to record it. We've had recent outbreaks within the last 100 and some odd years that history remembers well, 1918. We've gone through outbreaks of unanticipated diseases like HIV, Ebola, Zika, and now COVID now. It is foolish to think that we're not going to continue to have that in the future. And I think that's what we really need to appreciate. You know, way back in the late 60s and the early 70s, there were some pundits right here in Washington who were saying, now that we have vaccines and antibiotics, the era of infectious diseases is over. There were people who testified before the Congress about that. What they didn't appreciate is that given the balance between the microbial world and the human civilization, there will always be emerging and re-emerging infections, without a doubt. We're not going to stop the emergence. What we can do is we can prevent the emergence from becoming a pandemic. And that's what preparedness is about. How you respond to an emerging outbreak to prevent it from becoming a pandemic. And that's a combination of public health measures at the global level, global health security networks, transparencies, surveillance, as well as fundamental science, namely better vaccines, better diagnostics, and better therapeutics.
I want to turn now to the subject of trust in science and the challenge of communicating key scientific findings and messages persuasively to the public. I know this is on many people's minds because I can see the Q&A. But I think I'll take this question, which is from Jackie Barton, who's the Kirkwood and Noyes Professor of Chemistry at Caltech, and is also on the board of Gilead Pharmaceuticals, who are, of course, of the makers of remdesivir. And Jackie's question is this, and she says, first, thank you for all you're doing for our country. I wanted to ask you about science and its role in our society going forward. Science and scientists seem to have lost the trust of many of the American people. From my perspective, the US has been a global center of scientific excellence and innovation, critical to the growth and health of our economy. And going forward, science will be needed to address critical global issues, pandemics, climate change, even how new gene splicing technologies are to be used. But science has increasingly come under attack, and science has become politicized in the general public rather than the source of facts and discoveries. How can we repair this loss of trust in science before the strength and value of our scientific enterprise is damaged?
You know, that's a great question, and the answer is not going to be easy, because we were dealing prior to COVID, prior to the political divisiveness that we see in society, not only in the United States, but in many countries throughout the world, that there was an anti-science feeling, probably because people were pushing back on different forms of authority. And science can be sometimes perceived by individuals as authoritative, telling people, these are the evidence, these are the data, this what you need to do. I think what scientists need to do is, as we move forward, is to reach out and engage the public in explaining the importance of science to the betterment of society as a whole and to the individuals in society. We've got to make sure that people understand that science, particularly in the arena of biomedical science of health, is purely directed at the health of the world and the health of your country and the health of individuals. What I have found, and I keep telling people about this, when scientists communicate with the rest of society, the important thing, and this is a really, I think, cogent point, the important thing is not to impress upon people how smart you are. The important thing is to get them to understand what you're talking about. So when you want to explain scientific principles and how you come to a conclusion based on scientific data, you've got to be able to relate to people and to not talk down to them, but not to confuse them, and to get them to understand that science is self-correcting and science collects data and evidence, and you act on the data and the evidence, which when you have an evolving situation like an outbreak, that data can change as you go along, which is the reason why there were things that we know now about the outbreak that we didn't know early on. We've got to be humble enough and honest enough to let people know that that's how science works. You collect data, you analyze it, and you act on the data that you have at that moment.
And when you say that to other scientists, how do they react? I mean, because when I talk to scientists and listen to scientists, a lot of them are, I think, to some extent losing faith in political leaders and in the public in terms of the receptiveness to that message. I mean, what do your colleagues say when you say you've got to be humble, you've got to explain it very carefully?
Well, you know, scientists are like anybody else. They're humans. It's human nature. Some of them say, to heck with it. If they don't want to hear us, goodbye. But I think most of the colleagues that I know are really aware of the importance of scientific communication and getting the public to appreciate how important science is. So at least the colleagues that I speak to are aware of this problem, and scientists need to get involved, not necessarily in politics, but in policy. So where they use the facts and the evidence of science to make sure that the proper policies are implemented. I think that the scientific community as a whole is very amenable to that.
Though I think I want to put it to you that one of the problems we've got is that the policy, which sounds like it's different from politics, actually most topics of policy contain politically contentious ideas, and within them there are arguments. And we, after I think many decades, perhaps more than half a century after the Second World War, where policymakers and indeed political leaders across the divide in many countries broadly deferred to science and to settled scientific opinion. As our broader politics has become more contentious, and as it were, the rules, you know, in England we have the Marquess of Queensberry boxing rules, as they began to give way to more of a rough and tumble about everything, science got drawn in and began to be kicked around in the way that economics and sociology is for many decades been kicked around by politicians. Is there any way of getting that sort of privileged status of the kind of discourse, the kind of language and the credibility of science, which once received special treatment, of getting that back, do you think?
Well, I'm a realist, Mark, but I'm also an optimist in many respects, and I think we can do that. Right now, we are in a situation, and I think it's very clear to people who are looking from the outside in, that we're in a very contentious, divisive component of our political situation in the United States. And when that happens to that degree, you are going to see so-called scientific issues essentially become politicized. I mean, we saw that, you know, right here in the United States. We have some people say that this is wrong, we don't care what the science says. Other people say this is right, the science says it. And it's almost an argument about facts. And when the facts are there, and yet people have an interpretation or a disregard of facts, which in fact is even more dangerous. So I think it's such an abnormal state that I have to believe that we're going to equilibrate back to more normality of doing what you said years ago, where people understood that a scientific observation, a scientific fact is going to be the same. You can try and interpret a little different, but those are the things that should be guiding the policy.
And there's a question or maybe a comment from Stephen Lippard, which is essentially, I think, possibly a positive note. Will light shone on science during the COVID crisis? And I want to say perhaps also the successful execution of a number of vaccines have any impact on the acceptance and support for science by society going forward?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, there's nothing like success. I think that you have a country that is in the grips of an extraordinary challenge that's frightening so many people. And then along comes science to develop a vaccine to essentially rescue us, if you want to use that terminology. I think that's going to engender a lot more confidence in what science has to offer society. Nothing like a tangible good result that applies to and affects people in their everyday lives.
And perhaps I could just finish with a couple of questions about as it were, 1 year, or I guess now 10 and a half months or 11 months or whatever it is in the life of Tony Fauci. Do you know how many media interviews and appearances in front of Senate committees and so on you've done so far this year? Is there a number you can share with us?
Yeah, it's several hundred. I mean, I wouldn't say it could be 1,000. I don't know, because I do several a day. You have to keep communicating, whether it's with the press or whether it's on a fireside chat or on a podcast. It's constant. It's so important to get the word out, to get people to understand what's going on, that I've been doing this virtually daily since the end of January, the beginning of February.
And you talked about some of your colleagues having a what the heck moment. Have there been moments where you've come, I mean, you've famously maintained your cool throughout, but when the president has accused you, he was wrong about this, wrong about that. Steve Bannon recently, he's a maverick but influential figure, called for you to be beheaded and your head put on a spike. I mean, are there moments when you just think this is beyond the pale, this is impossible, I have to say something?
No. The answer, Mark, is no. And the reason is that one thing I've learned over the years, it didn't start with COVID. It started with a variety of other things way back in the HIV days when the activists were attacking us and we had to develop good relationships with them. And it's certainly different now. I mean, what we're having is outright hostility where I require security. I cannot believe that because I'm saying something that's a public health message that triggers such hostility that I'm threatened physically. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. So what I've decided to do a long time ago is you got to learn how to compartmentalize. Just focus like a laser beam on what your job is and what you're trying to accomplish. And to me, the thing that's right up front is the safety, the health, and the welfare of the American public, and by extrapolation, the rest of the world. That's what I focus on. All that other stuff, although people cannot imagine that's the truth, but all that other stuff is noise. Steve Bannon is noise. People who want to throw me in a fire pit, that's noise. I need to focus on what my job is.
So, Dr. Fauci, at this moment, there should be thunderous applause in Franklin Hall. We can't do that, but I do want to thank you firstly for sparing us the time. I know how busy you are. You have to go on to your next interview in about 90 seconds. But I just want to say on behalf of the APS, more broadly, how proud we are of you, and to thank you for your wisdom, your public service, and your incredible resilience over this past year. So good luck. Thank you very much indeed. And Linda, if I can hand back to you.
Thank you, Mark. It was very nice to interact with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. That was an inspiring lesson to live by that Dr. Fauci's remarks ended with, I think. So thank you for this very special hour.